Our search for new allies in the worlds of Dungeons and Dragons brings us next to the ancient mountains, home to cities of stone, mines filled with gold, and dark dungeons hiding ancient secrets. There, at an ancient brewery, we find our new companions.
You behold before you a band of burly, broad-shouldered, bearded, beer-drinking, battle-ready dwarves.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we discuss everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
Today in our series, surveying the varied people that inhabit the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons, searching for inspiration for our next player characters, we come upon the staunch and stubborn dwarves, the people of stone who inhabit the mountains and the deep places of the earth.
Dwarves are amongst the most popular races in fantasy literature and mythology, and even speaking the word dwarf instills that image of the Tolkien mythos of the burly, strong warrior.
As such a well-loved fantasy staple, dwarves have inspired countless character ideas, and today we're going to be looking at their special abilities and talking about the great classes, features, backgrounds, and role-playing ideas that you could use for your next dwarf character in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
The cultural identity of dwarves has been remarkably consistent across many fantasy sources, whether you're looking at video games, the various worlds of Dungeons & Dragons, Tolkien, the Dwarves book series by Marcus Heitz. It's very, very consistent and doesn't diverge too much from this idea of dwarves as the mountain-dwelling warriors that carve runes and build cities of stone and have beards, love axes, and love beer.
Yeah, there's something oddly charming about these stout warriors who are really connected to their mountains, their underground cities. They have a strong cultural presence. Dwarves are so tied to their clans and traditions that it actually makes a really strong character, and you don't have to look far for inspiration for dwarves.
Yeah.
It's such an iconic character that the moment that you say it, you get an image in your head. Not only Gimli from Lord of the Rings, but the entire Hobbit series was full of iconic dwarves. To me, that's always stood out. But no matter where I look, there's iconic dwarf characters.
I even think of the dwarves of Warhammer Fantasy had such a great appeal as well, and I think really expanded on the notion of what dwarves are in tabletop games, building on their roots in Tolkien. And so if there's anything that is kind of picked up whole cloth and deposited into so many role-playing games and D&D settings, it's kind of like, worked for Tolkien, gonna just take this, drop this right in. Whereas with elves, people are always changing around what their elves are. People are always changing around what their human societies are like and creating a lot of diversity in there. But across dwarves, it's always so consistent. And I think that speaks to their nature of being these stubborn and implacable people as a whole.
Not only are dwarves stubborn people, but the people who play dwarves are usually pretty stubborn about sticking to their roots.
I think so too. I think that there's something about that stubbornness that calls to a certain type of player. And their very first character was a dwarf fighter that was always that axe-swinging, beer-drinking, kind of angry, kind of awkward, kind of rude and vulgar sort of person. And they love that character. They fell right into that archetype. And there's something really appealing and fun about it.
That's it. At the end of the day, there's something about just playing a dwarf who is rooted in its culture, but its culture is also one that's forgiving of social norms. Like the fact that they will just belch and drink their way to victory and say what they're thinking and swing axes and talk about how great they are in battle. There's something oddly charming and fun about bringing that to the table.
But then they hold grudges and remember things for generations and are very serious when it comes to building things and warfare and who their enemies are. So I think that for a lot of players, the appeal of role-playing a dwarf is actually that these two extremes of a human, of kind of being this kind of vulgar, I want to fight, but then also having honor to you, having the stubbornness, and having this bravery and determination, I think is really, really appealing and really what drives a lot of people to want to roleplay dwarves, because those elements of our own human nature are dialed up to 11.
And really, what makes a better adventurer than somebody who is determined, who is stubborn, who knows that they're good in a battle and says, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to slay monsters. I'm going to fight for my people. It's just a really powerful thing to get behind, and something that is really easy to role play because all of us already understand that. You mix this kind of stubborn strongness with the ingenuity and engineering that dwarves have. So they're not a dumb brute. They are a highly intelligent species that builds incredible architecture, minds, better than any other species in the D&D mythos.
Yeah.
And it's really compelling that you have both sides of those coin.
The other thing I think that a lot of people really love about dwarves is that dwarves have a very powerful sense of duty and loyalty. And they don't give their loyalty, they don't give their trust easily, but when it is given, it means something. Like a dwarf's word is something that is perhaps more precious to them than gold. And so if they give it to you, you have a true treasure. And I think for a lot of people, that notion of community that dwarves have, that tightly knit loyalty, is something that they really love, and they find that, and that helps the dwarf kind of be this anchor in the party as well, because it's like, you are my clan now.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, behind their gruff exterior, the true treasure of the dwarf people is friendship.
In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, we have two subraces of dwarves, mountain dwarves and hill dwarves. Ostensibly, one of these groups live in the lowlands and the hills, and another dwells beneath the great mountains. But between both, there's a couple traits that are the same.
So all dwarves have dark vision.
Yes.
Which makes sense, because they mostly live underground. Their eyes would be attuned to that. Their speed is actually a little bit slower than some of the other races out there.
Dwarf speed is only 25 feet, but it is never reduced by wearing heavy armor.
That makes sense, too.
Yeah.
That's very on point with the dwarf.
They always get a +2 bonus to their constitution score, and this is awesome. So regardless of which subrace you choose for your dwarf, there's not a single class in the game that doesn't like to get a nice meaty +2 constitution bonus.
And how fitting is that? The dwarves are these stout, hardy creatures, and so giving them +2 to con just helps amp up that HP.
The other thing that contributes to their resilience is that dwarves all have resistance to poison damage and advantage on saving throws against effects that apply the poison condition. And poison is one of the most common damage types in the monster manual, and it is attached to some really nasty abilities that are found on monstrosities, beasts. There are undead, demons, things like Yuan Ti and the Dark Elves all have poison-based abilities. It is remarkably common, and taking half damage from those attacks and having advantage on your saving throws against the poison condition is useful for far more than just packing back the alcohol.
Although it is really funny to imagine a whole party around a table where the alcohol has been poisoned by their enemy, and they all drink it and pass out, and the dwarf finishes, slams the cup down, and asks for another.
That was strong, yeah. All dwarves also get some additional proficiencies. So all of them are proficient in battle axes, war hammers, and a few other martial weapons, which is a nice little perk depending on which class you pick. And you also get your choice of proficiency in a tool, like brewer's supplies, smith supplies, or mason's tools, because all dwarves take up a trade.
Dwarves also all have stone cunning, which means that when they make an intelligence history check on stonework, they get to act as if they have expertise, which is their proficiency bonus doubled for that roll.
Yeah, so it gives them a little bit of extra ways of recognizing who made the dungeon that you're in.
Yeah, if there's reason that the lore of stonework could grant you information that you otherwise would not have, the dwarves are the ones to look into that. So we have the two iterations of the dwarf, the hill dwarf and the mountain dwarf.
Yeah.
The hill dwarf gets a +1 to wisdom, and they get to add 1 to their HP increase every time they level up.
And the mountain dwarf gains a whopping +2 bonus to their strength, and they're also proficient in light armor and medium armor.
Looking at all those traits, what classes are we going to look at for the dwarves?
Well, I think that because Constitution is the bread and butter of the dwarf, regardless, I think that you can find a lot of success with almost any class as a dwarf. But your choice of subrace is then going to influence what your primary attribute is. And in this case, we've either got wisdom-based classes or strength-based classes, depending on whether you want to be a mountain dwarf or a hill dwarf.
Immediately when we think of the hill dwarf and the mountain dwarf, I imagine that the hill dwarf steers itself more towards the cleric class, and the mountain dwarf steers itself more towards the fighter class. Really, there's a lot of other classes that you could look at that use either wisdom or strength, but these ones feel iconic to the dwarf.
I agree with you. I think that fighters and clerics are iconic dwarf classes and really reflect the common portrayals of how dwarven culture works in many Dungeons and Dragons settings. But I've found myself really, really interested in the dwarves' connection to the earth and how that can actually be represented in looking at the dwarves' connection to nature. And do they see themselves as having a spiritual connection to the earth? Because if so, mountain dwarves make great barbarians, and hill dwarfs would make great druids.
These are also excellent choices, and I do love the idea of flipping the druid a little bit. When we think of druids, we think of forests, we think of flowers, we think of all things that grow. But the druid is of the earth.
Yes.
And so are dwarves.
I'm really interested in embracing this spirituality that dwarves might possess in their connection to the earth. Because the traits that they get as dwarves work really, really nicely for a druid.
If we are looking at a more iconic dwarf character, they do lend themselves really well to being a very strong fighter. They have a really good combat presence. That includes the barbarian as well. Both axe-wielding, awesome dwarf combatants. And the cleric, you have things like the forge domain and the nature domain, which I do think really speak to a dwarf player.
Although I have to say, for other classes, I love the dwarven spin on so many other classes. I really love the idea, for example, of a dwarven paladin, because I think that that is a very big fusion between the dwarf fighter and the dwarf cleric that just really sings. And the ability scores are right in the right place, because it means that you can get your really good strength score, and paladins want to have a good constitution score, and then you can actually invest some of your ability points or a good roll into your charisma, knowing that your strength and con are going to get boosted up by the dwarves' innate toughness and strength. I could see the dwarves having entire regiments of rangers, of Gloomstalker rangers, who go out as the advanced formations, scouting for the threats of the Underdark and looking for the new mineral veins. I could see there being a really interesting dwarven criminal underworld with a bunch of dwarven rogues. So I think that those are interesting archetypes that integrate really well into ideas of dwarves, but explore different elements that would definitely exist in their cultures and societies. And even ultimately, I really love the idea of dwarven wizards and spellcasters, and dwarves' attachment to things like lore and stories and ballads mean that a dwarf bard is a pretty awesome idea.
I've seen a lot of really fun playstyles that don't necessarily tie in with the ability scores that dwarves get, but a drunken master dwarf monk.
Oh my god, that would be so amazing.
It's
That'd be
right at
so
home.
funny. It really is. It works so well. That is the tavern master, right? That loves nothing more than a good brawl, right? Dwarves speak with their fists. What is more, they love working with their hands. From a mechanical perspective, that is one of the great strengths of the dwarf. They have a fantastic package of attributes, and the way that they impact ability scores of always getting the constitution boost and then choosing strength or wisdom means that virtually every class in the game has something to gain from what dwarves have to offer. And it just means that maybe your primary ability score, if you're playing a dexterity-based class, yes, you can't max that out, but everything else lines up so nicely that it might be worth considering it, especially considering the role-playing boons that it offers.
So let's talk about the backgrounds that we would associate with the dwarves.
Obviously, things like soldiers and nobles are going to be very common amongst the dwarves. There is no more classic tale than the dwarven noble ousted from their ancestral home, seeking to reclaim it.
The other one that I always think of is the folk hero, because if you imagine a dwarf community, the warriors are somebody who everybody in the community would look up to. So being an established warrior in a dwarf community makes you that folk hero or a gladiator.
Yeah, or the guild artisan, because you're a dwarf, you were a dwarven smith, a dwarven brewer, and now you're going to go make it out in the world. You see this a lot in human culture as well, where there's very traditional communities where they have a coming of age rite where a person as they're growing up is expected to leave the community to experience the wider world so that they can kind of get all the wildness out of them before they settle down and conform back to their tradition. So I really like the idea that young dwarves are kind of these fiery spirits. They view themselves like the young volcanoes need to go out and get the lava out of them so that they may become the true mountains of stone upon which the pillars of the next generation will be built.
Let's talk a little bit about the personality traits and flaws of a dwarf. We've kind of touched on this a bit. They're like their whole personality trait of this kind of hot-headed, stubborn, slightly arrogant maybe in their youth, but like strong-willed character.
Yeah, I think part of that strength, we touched on their loyalty and their sense of duty, but also the notion that dwarves as a people are engineers and builders, that they want to build things to last. They want to build relationships that last. They value things that are well built, and a dwarf can see something, they can see shoddy workmanship a mile away.
I can imagine a dwarf who thinks that human construction tactics are barbaric and horrible, and analyzes every city that they walk into. And they're like tapping on the buildings that they're walking by, being like, this is shoddy stonework at best.
See, I would love that as a personality trait for like a dwarf transmutation wizard. Or a dwarf artificer, if you're using the Unearthed Arcana rules, would be really cool. That building of things. At the same time, I think a lot of dwarves have some serious flaws.
Well, what I think is great about dwarves is most of their strengths can easily cross the line to being flaws.
Stubbornness is definitely a flaw.
And they're hardy, but sometimes they're foolhardy.
Absolutely. I think that dwarven pride means that they refuse to acknowledge situations where they should back down.
Yes, and that's a huge flaw.
Yeah.
Dragons confronting you, parties running away, dwarfs going to be standing there with their battle axe being like, I got this.
And they hold on to grudges and they don't forgive very easily. The nature of their grudges drives them to seek vengeance and justice. And so they can have this very reciprocal notion of justice that is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Dwarves are greedy and they are driven to appetites and excesses of consumption. They love to eat. They love to drink.
And they love treasure.
They love treasure. And they love treasure not because it's valuable in itself, but also what it represents. Like, they like specific treasures. It's like, this is mine because it was my family's for thousands of years. And I could see a dwarf seeing a merchant counting out coins, and they see a coin that was stamped with the seal of their clan, and they would say, where did you get that?
I think the beauty of the dwarf, like I've said, is just you have these easy personality traits to latch onto that you can also play up as easy to access flaws. They, for me, are one of the most fun types of character to roleplay because you can go over the top and it feels appropriate.
My go-to character when I'm dropping into a group that I've never played with before for a one-shot or a quick game is my dwarf cleric Volgar Stormhammer, who is a Tempest Domain cleric of Thor that is just trying to build the greatest ship with the greatest crew to honor Thor and sail the seas. He wants to build a ship that will be unto a mountain atop the waters in the name of Thor.
Can we also talk for a second about how great dwarven last names always are?
Yes.
It's always like Stonehammer or Silver Anvil, or like you always just take two strong, powerful, earthly, blacksmithy words and slam them together.
If you're at a loss, just look up names of craft breweries. And then throw on your best Norse or Germanic name, and you have your dwarf.
I also love a dwarf who wants to hit up every tavern along their adventure and always complains about the quality of the ale. They always want to. They're like, let's try this tavern. And every time, oh, this is disappointing. Do you have any dwarven ale? There's so many fun character traits to play into. You talked about them sending their dwarves out, but what if you had dwarven communities that were strictly underground?
Yes.
And then you have this really fun flaw of a dwarf who has a horrible misconception of what the surface world is because all that they've heard are folk stories.
I like this. Yes.
So they come
very
out
isolationist.
Yeah, and they come out and they're like, "What are you doing on the surface? I heard that you have a big rock in the sky, and I'm gonna go get it and bring it back." And they're like, "You can't do that."
That's the moon. We need that.
Yeah, and they're like, "Well, no, it's just a rock. It's
What's
right
a
up
rock
there.
supposed to be doing up in the sky?
I'm gonna come get."
Yeah.
Like, just unreasonable expectations for what the surface world is, and that lack of understanding. They're not stupid, but the way they interact with society is so vastly different. Maybe they've never seen a forest, or they don't understand the way the sky works. And when it turns to night, what are all those stars up there? Are those gems? Are those jewels? Can they collect them? There's so many misinterpretations that could happen with a dwarf who's only heard folk stories about what the surface world is like. There are so many iconic dwarf characters that playing into the stereotype of a dwarf is not a bad thing and can still be really compelling and really fun. The dwarf fighter, the dwarf cleric, these are iconic builds that will just be absolutely great to bring to your table.
At the same time, there's so many great ways to play against type with a dwarf that are really, really rewarding and capture the essence and the resonance of what makes dwarves in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons. Trying out something like a dwarven drunken master monk or a College of Lore or College of Valor bard can be a refreshing take on a fantasy classic and really illuminate new ways to roleplay in your next campaign.
So this has been a look at dwarves in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you've played an awesome dwarf character, tell us about them in the comments below.
And if you're enjoying the show, consider supporting our work on Patreon. You can find out how by following the links in the description below.
Don't forget to check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we have plenty more guides to the races and classes of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.